Welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining with us for today's webinar, Requirements of the New EU Medical Device Regulation and Post-Market Surveillance, PMS. Before I start with our webinar, I would like to give you some information about the webinar. The webinar will be recorded, and during the webinar, all participants will be muted. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the chat function on the left side. We will collect all your questions and reply to you after the webinar. Please also write me an email if you have any specific questions later. Now, please let me introduce myself. My name is Yue Li, and I am a consultant of PROSYSTEM GmbH, an NSF International company. I have several years' experience in the field of regulatory affairs and clinical affairs. My professional focus as a consultant is clinical affairs and global registration of medical devices. Okay, so let's get started. As we already know, in May 2017, the EU Commission released two new regulations. The Regulation on Medical Devices 2017/745 and the Regulation on In Vitro Diagnostic Medical Devices 2017/746. These regulations repeal the previous EU directives for medical devices and active implantable devices, and the EU Directive on In Vitro Diagnostic Medical Devices. The MDR expands the MDD content from 20 articles to 123 articles and increases to 175 pages, as opposed to 16 pages in MDD. The number of the annexes was also increased from 12 to 17. This is based on new or revised content as well as the inclusion of requirements for active implantable devices. Although the new regulation has much more detail and is more stringent, the new regulation follows the principle of the MDD under the new legislative framework, such as conformity assessment, the notified body system, and application of harmonized standards. However, there are also several significant changes introduced. For example, common specifications besides harmonized standards, UDI and UDAMID. Reclassifications, more stringent requirements on clinical evidence and post-market surveillance. The objective of this revision of the European Medical Device Regulation is to improve the protection of health and the safety of medical devices. Nevertheless, the fundamental regulatory model remains unchanged, including supervision of notified bodies. However, the notified bodies need to be redesignated. The conformity assessment process and risk-based review, clinical data, vigilance, and market surveillance are still required. MDR also defines a faster legal reaction time for adverse event reporting, both for manufacturer and competent authorities. Another essential change is to establish the UDI system and the UDAMID database to ensure the transparency and traceability of medical devices. In a nutshell, the aim of the revision is to have a solid, transparent, predictable, and sustainable legal framework that nevertheless encourages innovation. The transition period of the EU MDR lasts 3 years. On the 26th of May 2017, the EU MDR came into force. The 26th of May 2020, the MDR applies and the notified body need to issue certificates according to the EU MDR. Since Class 1 devices do not involve the notified body assessment and certifications, for all Class 1 medical devices, the MDR will not directly apply in 2020 without a transition period. Certificates issued by notified bodies in accordance with MDD from 25 May 2017 shall remain valid until the end of the period indicated on the certificate, which shall not exceed 5 years from its issuance. They shall, however, become void at the latest on 27th May 2024. After 27th of May 2025, certificates can only be issued in accordance with the EU MDR. In today's webinar, we are going to put the focus specifically on the requirements for PMS. Although there have been few changes to the current practice of monitoring and processing feedback and complaints, we will shine light on some of the most important additions to Vigilance, such as trend reporting. In the EU MDR, the requirements are defined in Chapter 7, explicitly describing detailed requirements on post-market surveillance, vigilance, and market surveillance. Article 83 to Article 86 defines the requirements for PMS and obligations of manufacturers. Article 87 to 92 defines requirements on vigilance system and the obligations of the competent authorities. As you can see, there are several new elements defined that will be discussed later in this webinar. This includes, for example, defined planning and documentation of post-market surveillance outcome, as well as the new periodic safety update report for Class 2A, 2B, and Class 3 medical devices. In Article 93 to 100, the EU MDR defines requirements on market surveillance. Though certainly interesting as bedtime reading, we will not go into further detail since these requirements are mostly relevant for competent authorities. The preamble of the MDR says in number 17.4 that the manufacturer should play an active role during the post-market phase by systematically and actively gathering information from post-market experience with their devices in order to update their technical documentation. This is done by establishing a comprehensive post-market surveillance system in the quality management system and setting up a post-market surveillance plan. So, unambiguously, the MDR requires manufacturers to proactively collect experience data, and the PMS system should be comprehensive and based on the PMS plan. The PMS will contribute to continuously update the technical documentation, for example, your risk assessment and clinical evaluation. The MDR provides also a new definition for PMS. PMS is defined to be all activities carried out by manufacturer in cooperation with other economic operators to institute and keep up to date a systematic procedure to proactively collect and review experience gained from devices they place on the market, make available on the market, or put into service for the purpose of identifying any need to immediately apply any necessary corrective and preventive actions. For manufacturers, this means that you should take advantage of any data source that you have within your distribution channel, at least when it comes to so-called reactive data sources. And if you are a distributor, importer, or authorized representative, you have to be aware of your importance within a feedback chain from market to manufacturer and back. Why has PMS become one of the most important and resource-demanding issues of the MDR? The regulation now mandatorily asks manufacturers to implement and maintain a PMS system to an extent that has not been asked before. This is stated in a number of articles, starting with Article 10 on the general obligation of the manufacturers. Section 9 and 10 require manufacturers that their quality management system addresses the post-market surveillance system according to Article 18.3. This picks up the requirement of the ISO 13485-2016, where it also says that manufacturers should have documented procedures, which include provisions to gather data from production as well as post-production activities. While the standards stop there, the regulation picks up this requirement and provides further detail on the content and methodology of this system, as well as we will see on the following slides. As I already mentioned before, the requirement to have a PMS system is not new. EU MDD, NBMED 2.12 and MADEF 2.12/2 have all had elements of PMS activities, which were now merged into the MDR. Detailed requirements for PMS, PMCF, and Vigilance are described in 8 articles and 2 annexes of the EU regulation. The requirements are very detailed and much more than the requirements set in the ISO standards. To make it clear, PMS is an essential element of the quality management system. There are proactive PMS such as PMCF and reactive PMS such as the manufacturer's vigilance system. Now, let's dive into the requirements for PMS in more detail. As we already discussed, PMS system must obviously be an integral part of the quality management system and contribute to the quality, safety, and performance of the device. The MDR practically gives away the purpose section of your procedure for free. For each device or device group, the manufacturer must establish a PMS system, which should be designed in a manner to actively and systematically collect, record, and analyze relevant data on the quality, performance, and safety of a product throughout the product lifecycle. Based on the PMS results, the manufacturer must be able to draw conclusions and identify, conduct, and monitor any preventive and corrective actions. The ability to come up with appropriate follow-up actions is one of the most important indicators on the long run, which will allow you to say whether your PMS system is adequate and effective. So, what does proactive PMS mean? Let's look at it step by step. First, the manufacturer has to actively figure out the appropriate data that is required to continuously verify and ensure the safety and performance of the device throughout its entire lifetime. Second, the manufacturer must specify the sources and data gathering methods that deliver the required information. In addition to that, where appropriate, the manufacturer must define thresholds and acceptance criteria that are required to trigger subsequent actions. For some PMS activities, it is recommended to refer to procedures or work instructions, which already facilitate a systematic and reproducible gathering, recording, and analyzing of relevant data. And the third and the most obvious activity in the PMS system is to actively gather data, for example, by means of surveys, studies, or literature reviews. The data gathered by the manufacturer should be used to update the benefit risk determination, to update the design and manufacture information, the instruction for use and labeling. In MADEF 2.7/1 Revision 4, it is already mentioned that the PMS data should be used to update the clinical evaluation. The SSCP is a new requirement in the MDR, which is only relevant for Class 3 and implantable devices. The SSCP report must also be updated whenever updates to the risk management, clinical evaluation, or other accompanying documentation for the eyes of the public are required. PMS data has a potential to identify the need for CAPAs or FSCAs to improve their usability or product performance and safety. The data should furthermore be evaluated whether it may contribute to the PMS or other devices that the manufacturer places on the market, and very importantly, to the detection of trends. But if you look at all these interfaces that are stated in Article 83, only the requirement to update the SSCP report is entirely new, All other interfaces were already required either by the Medical Device Directive, by standards such as ISO 13485 for Medical Device Quality Management System, or ISO 14971 for risk management, or by guidance documents. Looking at the design and develop phase of a typical medical device lifecycle, the intended purpose determines the extent of risk management and clinical evaluation activities, which are the main drivers to meet the pre-market requirements. The risk management has a major impact on your product design in collaboration with usability engineering. And based on the risk management, manufacturers will present the residual risks, contraindications, warnings on their labeling. The clinical evaluation will then verify that the benefit outweigh the risks and the device is that the device meets the state of the art. However, no matter how comprehensive your verification and validation activities are, there will be always some gaps that will be filled with post-market data. Once your product is placed on the market, the main drivers shifted. PMS then plays the important role for potential changes. With a comprehensive PMS system, you will be able to monitor the safety and performance of your device and continually update your technical documentation as you learn from the post-market phase. For example, incidents will provide feedback that may require reassessing your risk management, such as that the severity or probability of the harm or incidents may indicate that risk control measures that you have implemented are not effective and not as effective as initially determined. In addition, based on PMCF, your clinical evaluation will be updated. The benefit risk determination will be reassessed and further potential medical alternatives could be identified. Furthermore, based on the appropriate PMS activities such as surveys, you may be able to identify unknown use errors, which are important input to your usability engineering. Therefore, it is important that the PMS team comprises of experts who are familiar with these interfaces. At this point, PMS is not only the regulatory burden, but a chance for manufacturers to continuously improve the safety and performance of your product. As we have seen, PMS interacts with other documented processes that are already mandatory part of every quality management system, and as we already discussed, the requirements on PMS are not new. However, from our project experience, manufacturers often lack to capture the full extent of the PMS requirements that have already been out there. Therefore, manufacturers must take the PMS requirements from MDR, perform a gap analysis, and extend existing procedures or implement new procedures where necessary. It will not come as a shock to you that most of the requirements regarding to the content of the technical documentation are not new when compared to the MDD. The most striking, however, is a new requirement that the PMS documentation must be part of the technical documentation. Regarding the impact on the interfaces to PMS as elaborated in Article 18.3, it is only consistent to include the PMS documentation in the technical documentation. For example, the benefit risk analysis and risk management document will be affected by PMS findings, and after placing on the market of your device, your clinical data will be extended by the PMZ Report. The additional effort that you have to make for your technical documentation are PMS Plan, PMS Report, and the PSUR, Periodic Safety Update Report, and the PMCF Report. In the pre-market phase, your clinical data will be evaluated in the CER. However, In the post-market phase, the PMCF report may be the main document that updates your clinical evaluation. So let's have a closer look to see what the requirements for all of these records are. The PMS plan is required for all medical devices and is part of the technical documentation. As mentioned before, all the required PMS activities must be coordinated in the plan. Annex 3 lists a minimum number of required data, which we will take a look at on the next slide. The arrow on the right hand indicates that the effort for PMS must be proportional with the device's risk class. The higher the risk, the more intense and frequent the PMS and PMCF activities will have to be. Previously, a reactive approach for lower risk devices, for example, by screening complaints databases, would have been accepted, as long as you were able to present strong clinical evidence for safety and performance coming from your pre-market activities. However, in the future, it is most likely that your notified body will require you to proactively collect data on the clinical safety and clinical performance of your device, regardless of its classification. But certainly, a manufacturer of a Class 1 device is not expected to perform the same extent and frequency of post-market clinical follow-ups as the Class 3 devices. For your Class 1 device, your notified body may accept studies that are simpler in design, therefore reducing the threshold for the patient to participate and reducing the associated costs to complete the investigation. The Annex 3 of the MDR sets a requirement for a PMS plan. The PMS plan must describe the process and frequency of activities for gathering post-market data and must cover proactive and systematic procedures to collect any required information. The process shall allow for correct characterization of the performance of the devices and shall also allow a comparison to be made between the device and similar products available on the market. The data source should be defined in the PMS plan. It could be information on serious incidents, information from a safety report, and FSCAs. It is important to mention that publicly accessible information about similar medical devices should also be used as input. Furthermore, you should also address in the PMS plan the suitable indicators and threshold values that are necessary to be able to continuously reassess the benefit-risk analysis and the risk management. Also, methods and protocols to communicate effectively with competent authorities, notified bodies, economic operators, and users should be documented in the plan. The PMCF plan or justification why a PMCF is not applicable must also be a part of PMS plan. And there are little reasons to argue why you would be PMCF exempt. The most prominent ones being Article 16.1, Paragraph 10, on clinical evaluation exemptions, and if you are a manufacturer of devices without medical purpose according to the Annex 16. Last but not least, Annex 3 enables manufacturers to reference to procedures which help you fulfill the PMS requirement. This may reduce the extent of describing certain aspects of the methods that are required to be elaborated in the PMS plan. Examples may be the feedback and reporting procedures, which are a mandatory requirement in every manufacturer's quality management system. Criteria that trigger subsequent actions should still be stated in the plan, even when you are referencing to other procedures. In addition to the PMS plan, the manufacturers have to generate the PMS report or the Periodic Safety Update Report, short PSUR. which are also part of the technical documentation. The PMS report, according to Article 85, is only required for Class 1 devices, and it merely summarizes the results and conclusions of the analysis of the collected PMS data together with a justification and description of any preventive and corrective actions taken. For all other medical devices, your report will be called the PSUR. The PSUR requires further detail than the PMS report, such as the conclusion from the benefit risk assessment, main findings of the PMCF, the sales history of the device, an evaluation of the size and other characteristics of the population using the device, and the usage frequency of the device. The update frequencies of reports are risk-based. For Class 1 devices, you may update the report when necessary, but we recommend a period of no longer than 5 years. This should be stated in the PMS Plan as well. The PSUR for Class 2A is required to be updated at least every 2 years, or sooner if required. For Class 3 and Class 2B devices, the report should be updated at least annually. In addition, for Class 3 and Class 2B implantable devices, the report should be submitted in the UDAMAID database and will be assessed by the notified body annually. For other devices, the report will be assessed by the notified body upon request. However, when any new information is received which may have an impact on the existing documentation, you must update your report immediately. Here, we have a closer overview about the PSUR for devices other than Class 1 devices. The results of a PMCF under the MDR are an input into the PSUR, which also includes the summary of results and conclusions of PMS, any preventive and corrective actions, a re-evaluation of the benefit risk determination of the device, and the volume of sales. The sales volume puts into perspective the accuracy of the risk-benefit evaluation. We would advise having a clinical expert review and sign up on PSUR, as this is a key document demonstrating compliance with the regulation and which also must be made public on the UDAMAID database. According to the regulation, we could see that the PMCF findings is one of the input for PSUR. So, theoretically, a PMCF would be required for all these classes of devices. On the other hand, elsewhere in the regulation, it is stated that some products can be exempted from PMCF if duly justified. As far as we know, under the new EU MDR, there is a group of Class 2B implantable devices known as well-established technologies that are listed as exempt from clinical investigation for CE marking. Therefore, this could be also applied for PMCF. These are sutures, staples, dental fillings, dental braces, tooth crowns, screws, wedges, plates, wires, pins, clips, or connectors for which the clinical evaluation is based on sufficient clinical data and is in compliance with the relevant product-specific common specifications, where such a common specification is available. However, again, the sufficient clinical data is a problem, and the CS is not yet clear. Don't get panicked if you hear PMCF, since in the EU MDR, a PMCF does not necessarily mean that you have to conduct a clinical study. MDR defines PMCF as a continuous process that updates the clinical evaluation and shall be addressed in the manufacturer's post-market surveillance plan. So, we know that PMCF is the main source of clinical data in the post-market phase and is part of the PMS system. When conducting PMCF, the manufacturer shall proactively collect and evaluate clinical data. However, it is important to note that the requirement for PMCF under MDR does not necessarily mean that clinical studies will be required in all cases to collect clinical data, which is what is currently understood as PMCF under the current directives due to the wording in MedDev guidance document. Under the MDR, the definition is much broader and relates to all types of clinical information. It could be the literature data, real-world clinical data from the registries or complaints, technical information, and publicly available information, whereas PMCF under the MedDev is very much focused on PMCF studies and clinical data. As an essential part of the proactive PMS, the aims of the PMCF are to, firstly, confirm the safety and performance of the device throughout its expected lifetime, identify previously unknown side effects, and monitor the identified side effects and the contraindications, such as to identify rare complications. Furthermore, identify and analyzing emergent risks on the basis of factual evidence, which could be obtained from the clinical observation in a larger patient population or long-term use. Ensure the continued acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio, and last but not least, identify possible systematic misuse or off-label use of the device, with a view to verifying that the intended purpose is correct. As I already mentioned, the PMCF is part of the proactive PMS activities, and therefore the PMS plan must include the PMCF plan or a reference to the PMCF plan if you decide to have two separate plans. Based on the PMCF plan, manufacturer will perform the activities and generate the PMCF report, and the PMCF report is the input for your PSUR or PMS report. For Class 3 and implantable devices, the PMCF report should be updated annually. In the PMCF plan, you should address the following elements. First, the general methods and procedures of the PMCF to be applied, such as gathering the clinical experience, feedback from users, screening the scientific literature, and of other sources of clinical data. Second, the specific method and procedures of PMCF to be applied, such as evaluation of suitable registers, interviews, or PMCF studies. Third, a rationale for the appropriateness of the method and procedures used, and also the detailed and adequately justified time schedule for PMCF activities to be undertaken by the manufacturer. You should also include that the specific objectives to be addressed by the PMCF, and if there's any reference to the relevant part of the clinical evaluation report and to the risk management. If you refer any harmonized standards, you should also add the reference in the PMCF plan. However, sometimes it is beneficial to conduct the PMCF studies, such as that you use the clinical data of an equivalent device, or your device is already entered the market long, but there's no sufficient clinical data available for the device. In these cases, you may consider to conduct the PMCF study to collect the clinical data of the already CE-marked devices. There will be no need to address the equivalent device for clinical data. Potentially, study types could be prospective or retrospective, such as gather the data from the registries or hospital information system, as well as user surveys or conducting new literature search. Depends on your gaps. Comparing to the pre-market clinical investigation, PMCF study may save you cost and time. Here are some examples about typical PMCF methods. We should also keep in mind that the PMCF studies mainly focus on patient data. For prospective studies, the involvement of competent authority and ethics committee is necessary. when a clinical trial has to be conducted. On another hand, retrospective patient data is usually obtained from hospital information systems. The involvement of the ethics committee is also necessary. There are also simpler options for the low-risk devices, such as to review the scientific literature data according to MedDev 2.7/1 Revision 4. And if the PMCF is not focused on patient data, but rather on user experience, in order to support the usability or to verify the validity of the instruction for use, it is also possible to conduct customer survey or questionnaires. The manufacturer shall analyze the findings of the PMCF and document the results in a PMCF evaluation report that shall be part of the clinical evaluation report and the technical documentation. The conclusion of the PMCF evaluation report shall be taken into account for the clinical evaluation and in the risk management. If through the PMCF the need for preventive or corrective measures has been identified, the manufacturer shall implement them. Now, let's move on to the second section, Vigilance. Manufacturers shall notify the relevant competent authorities if there's any serious incidents or any field safety corrective action. The main change in the EU MDR regarding reporting to the regulatory authorities is that the reporting timeline for serious incident was shortened. So, for the serious incident, the manufacturer should report them not later than 15 days. Before, the timeline was 13 days. For serious public health threat, the reporting timeline is not changed in the MDR. You have to report the incident within 2 days. Also, for the cases where an incident leads to death or an anticipated serious adverse event, the manufacturer must not notify the competent authority immediately, but not later than 10 days. In order to report all the incidents in time, there is a possibility of an initial report followed by a completed report. In addition, in the event of uncertainty, an incident should be reported anyways within an applicable period. In general, field safety corrective actions must first be reported and then taken in with the expectations of emergencies. Furthermore, Article 18.7 describes the possibilities of periodic summary notifications rather than individual notification. The competent authority has to agree to this practice first. So, how about the non-serious incidents? These are the incidents which are not required to be reported. The MDR, however, asks manufacturers to monitor these non-serious incidents and report any significant increase in the frequency or severity of such incidents, which may have a significant impact on the benefit-risk analysis and may lead unacceptable risks over benefit when it comes to the health and safety of patients or users of medical devices. There are a couple of things here. The manufacturer is required to establish what an intolerable significance increase is. Now, the requirement asks to report significant increase in the frequency over a specific period of time. If these increases have an impact on the benefit-risk analysis, but when a significant increase in the severity has been identified, this would mean that the severity of the harm has been established inaccurately, which would instantly make this non-serious incident a serious incident that must be reported according to the Article 18.7. It does not make sense to monitor the significant increase in the severity over a specific period of time, since a significant increase in the severity means that it has the potential to harm someone. That means manufacturer should specify in the PMS plan how these kind of incidents are to be managed, descriptions of the methodologies to determine any statistically significant increase in the frequency of such incidents, and the observation period. There may be more than one threshold value for various non-serious incidents. The plan should also state that in case of a significant increase of the severity, these incidents will be reported and investigated in accordance with the requirements set forth in Article 18.7. The competent authority may make their own assessment of the reporting of trend and require the manufacturer to take appropriate measures. Therefore, it is important for the manufacturer to have a suitable system that are able to predicate the trends in complaints and incidents of their devices. After reporting, manufacturers are required to conduct investigations on serious incidents of the concerned medical device. The criteria for the necessary investigations were also defined in the MDR, such as the severity of harm, frequency of use of the device, intended and potential users, and so on. The analysis shall include risk assessment and field safety and corrective action. Manufacturers must work with competent authorities and notified bodies regarding the investigations. If the device is under investigation, no changes may be made to the product. At the request of the competent authority, manufacturers shall provide all documentation necessary for risk assessment. The competent authority monitors the investigation of a serious incident by the manufacturer. Once the manufacturer has completed the investigation, the final report should be submitted. Incident or field safety corrective actions relate to a substance which would be considered to be a medical product rather than derivatives. The competent authority shall be informed. The manufacturer shall ensure that information about the field safety corrective action taken comes to the users of the device in question without delay. Therefore, the field safety notice will be issued based on the FSCA. The field safety notice should cover, firstly, precise statement of the actions to be taken. Secondly, reference to the malfunction. Thirdly, reasons for the safety notice. And lastly, the risks for patients, users, and third parties. The field safety notice shall be edited in an official union language or languages determined by the member state in which a field safety corrective action is taken. The content of the field safety notice shall be consistent in all member states. Since the field safety notice is publicly accessible, the device UDI, single registration number, and manufacturer name will be addressed on the notice. The field safety notice will be submitted to the competent authority and made available in the Udemy system. Currently, there are already templates available for FSN on the official website. So, there will be an electronic system on vigilance and post-market surveillance as a subsystem of Udemy. The transparency of the product safety and performance will be therefore further strengthened. The safety information such as serious incident and FSCAs, periodic summaries reports, trend report, PSUR, and fight notices will be included in the electronic system and linked to the UDI database. The competent authority will have access to all the data. The notified body shall have limited access to the information of the devices. For the healthcare professionals and public, they will have appropriate levels of access to the electronic system. The Commission is setting up an electronic system for collecting and processing market vigilance information, such as surveillance activities, devices presenting an unacceptable risk, non-compliant products, preventive health protection measures. The electronic system of the market surveillance will be also included in the UDAMID. Health professionals, the public, and competent authorities of third countries will be given adequate access. It shall also establish the automatic transmission of serious incident report, trend report, field corrective action report, and periodic summary report to the competent authority of the member state and to the notified body which issued the certificate for the product in question. To summarize briefly, most of the requirements in MDR and PMS are not new. Manufacturer should establish for each device or device group a PMS system. As we already learned about, active is a keyword. Data should be gathered actively from the post-market surveillance system are used in many other fields, such as to update the clinical evaluation, the risk-benefit assessment, and to improve the product performance and safety. MDR requires the manufacturer to set active, continuous PMS system. The PMS system interacts with other processes and technical documentation. There will be additional documentation requirements such as PMS Plan, including the PMCF Plan, PSUR, trend reporting, and PMCF report. PMCF is part of PMS, aiming to conform the clinical safety and performance within the product lifetime and to discover unknown risks or side effects. For the vigilance part, manufacturers should notify the competent authorities if there is any serious incidents happened or any FSCAs was taken. In addition, how to analyze the serious incidents and FSCAs is defined. Last but not least, the transparency will be further increased by the electronic system for PMS and vigilance and market surveillance. So now we are reaching the last slide of today's webinar. Thanks very much for your attention. I hope you have already learned the main changes of requirement on PMS and vigilance according to the EU MDR. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. I will write to you personally after this webinar as soon as possible. Thanks for your attention, and I hope to hear from you soon. Bye.